If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Jack Mercer. I'm 35 years old, and I work as a park ranger in Olympic National Park, Washington. It's a quiet job, and that's exactly why I took it. After serving as a combat medic in the Korean War, I needed peace, something, far away from the chaos I left behind. But peace isn't always easy to find. Sometimes the memories come back when I least expect them. The sounds, the smells, the faces, they haunt me. My ex-wife couldn't handle it anymore, and honestly, I don't blame her. I live alone now in a small ranger cabin deep in the woods. It's isolated. No electricity, no phone line, just me in the forest. Most nights, it's quiet, except for the wind through the trees or the occasional howl of wolves in the distance. But lately, something's been bothering me. Something I can't quite explain. It started with footprints. It was just another routine patrol. I had my map, my compass, and my father's hunting knife strapped to my belt. The forest was calm that morning, the kind of calm that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. I was walking along a ridge when I noticed something strange in the dirt, a footprint. At first, I thought it was from a bear, but as I crouched down to get a better look, I realized it wasn't. The print was huge, at least 17 inches long, and shaped like a human foot, except the toes were spread wider, almost like they belonged to something that had never worn shoes. The strangest part, the prints weren't just on the ground. They went straight up the side of a cliff. I stood there for a long time, staring at those impossible tracks. My mind raced with questions. What kind of creature could leave prints like this? How could it climb a vertical rock face? And why did the tracks suddenly stop halfway up, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air? I took out my notebook and sketched the footprints, marking their location on my map. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. The forest felt different that day. The trees seemed taller, their shadows darker. Even the birds were quiet. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, running wild. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. Something wasn't right. A few days later, the park office got a call. 3 geology students had gone missing. They'd been hiking on a well-marked trail in perfect weather, but no one had seen or heard from them since. I was assigned to check their last known location. When I reached their campsite, I knew right away something was wrong. The tents were still there, but the sleeping bags had been ripped open from the inside. Their gear was scattered everywhere, but it wasn't random. The items formed a perfect circle around the campfire like someone, or something, had placed them that way on purpose. In the mud, near the site, I found the strange symbols pressed into the ground. They looked ancient, like something you'd see in an old history book about lost civilizations. I radioed back to the office to report what I'd found, but all I got was static. That's when I decided to bring in Thomas Blackfoot, an elder from the Kino tribe who lived nearby. Thomas had spent his whole life in these woods and knew more about them than anyone else. When Thomas arrived and saw the symbols in the mud, his face went pale. He didn't say much at first, just kept muttering something under his breath in his native language. Finally, he turned to me and said, "You've awakened them." "Awakened who?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "The Shadow Walkers," he said quietly. "They've been here longer than any of us. They watch from the trees, from the shadows. They don't like it when we disturb their land." Thomas explained that recent logging in the area might have angered these beings. He warned me to leave the site and not come back, but I couldn't just walk away, not with 3 people still missing. That night, as I sat alone in my cabin, I started feeling off. Time didn't feel right. One moment it was dark. The next, it was light again. I woke up miles away from my bed with no memory of how I got there. My watch showed 3 hours had passed, but it felt like only minutes. I started digging through old park records and found reports of similar disappearances in 1913, 1935, and 1946. Each time, people vanished without a trace, and their campsites were left just like this one. Strange symbols, torn sleeping bags, and no sign of a struggle. Whatever was happening here wasn't new, and it wasn't over. The park administration didn't take my concerns seriously. They chalked it all up to superstition and overactive imaginations. Probably just a bear, they said, but I knew better. I couldn't let this go, not with 3 lives on the line. A search party was put together. It wasn't much, just me, Deputy Sheriff Walter Klein, a local guide named Philip Redhawk, and Dr. Eleanor Hayes, an anthropologist who had been studying native legends in the area. Walter was skeptical from the start, rolling his eyes at every mention of shadow walkers or strange footprints. Philip, on the other hand, believed every word Thomas Blackfoot had said. He carried a small pouch of herbs and kept muttering prayers under his breath as we walked. We set out early in the morning, heading deeper into the forest than I'd ever been before. At first, everything seemed normal. The air was crisp, the trees towering above us like silent guardians. But as we moved further in, things started to change. The first thing we noticed was the silence. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of our boots crunching on the forest floor. Then our compasses stopped working. The needles spun wildly, pointing in every direction except north. Walter tried using his radio to call for backup, but all we got was this strange howling sound that sent shivers down my spine. By midday, we came across something none of us could explain. Structures made from twisted branches and logs. They weren't natural. Someone, or something, had built them. They looked like shelters, but they were too small for humans to use. Dr. Hayes took pictures and scribbled notes in her journal while Philip whispered something about warning signs. As we pressed on, the weather turned without warning. A dense fog rolled in so thick we could barely see a few feet ahead of us. Landmarks we'd passed earlier started appearing again, as if we were walking in circles. Even though I knew this forest like the back of my hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was shifting around us. Then it happened. Bill Thompson, a fellow ranger and my closest friend, was taking point when he suddenly vanished. One moment he was there, just a few steps ahead of me. The next, he was gone. We called out for him, searched the area for hours, but all we found was his cap lying on the ground, stained with blood. Walter started to panic after that. He pulled out his gun and began shouting into the trees, threatening whatever was out there to show itself. Philip tried to calm him down, but Walter's finger slipped on the trigger. The shot hit Philip in the leg. I'll never forget the look on Philip's face as he fell to the ground, clutching his wound and gasping for air. He told us to leave him behind, that it wasn't safe to stay in one place for too long, but I couldn't just abandon him. Dr. Hayes bandaged Philip's leg as best she could while I kept watch. The fog seemed to press closer around us, and I swear I saw shapes moving in the distance, tall, thin figures that disappeared whenever I tried to focus on them. By nightfall, it was clear we were no longer in control of this search. We decided to keep moving, even though none of us felt safe anymore. Philip was weak from blood loss, but he insisted on coming with us. "Stopping is worse," he said. "They'll find us if we stop." The deeper we went, the stranger things became. The twisted structures we'd seen earlier grew more elaborate. Branches, woven into impossible shapes like cages or spirals. Then we found the pictographs. They were carved into the bark of ancient trees, showing tall, thin figures standing over smaller ones that looked human. In one drawing, the tall figures seemed to be folding the humans, bending them into shapes that didn't make sense. Dr. Hayes was fascinated. She kept snapping pictures and writing in her journal, mumbling about ancient rituals and lost cultures. but her notes started to sound off. At one point, I glanced at her journal and saw sentences that didn't make sense. Words scrambled together like they'd been written by someone in a trance. The forest itself seemed to change around us. We passed the same rock formation 3 times, even though we were heading in a straight line. Landmarks appeared where they shouldn't be, and paths looped back on themselves endlessly. It felt like the forest was alive, watching us, playing with us. Then the sounds started. At first, it was faint, a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then it grew louder, turning into whispers and howls that echoed through the trees. Walter shouted into the darkness, demanding answers, but all he got was silence. That's when Philip collapsed. He'd been limping for hours, but now he couldn't go any further. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. "Leave me," he said. "You again. You have to keep going." Dr. Hayes wanted to stay with him, but Walter refused. "We're not splitting up," he said firmly. "Not again." Philip gave me a weak smile and handed me his pouch of herbs before closing his eyes. We left him there, surrounded by those twisted structures and eerie carvings. I hated myself for walking away, but deep down I knew he was right. We couldn't stop. As we pushed forward through the fog, the humming grew louder until it felt like it was inside my head. My thoughts became scrambled. I couldn't tell if we'd been walking for hours or minutes. Even my watch seemed broken, the hands spinning, wildly like my compass had earlier. Then we found it, the clearing. It wasn't supposed to be there. I was sure of it. In the middle of the clearing stood a circle of massive stones covered in more of those strange symbols. The air felt heavier here, like something was pressing down on us. Dr. Hayes stepped forward without hesitation, her eyes wide with wonder. "This is it," she whispered. "This is what they've been hiding." She didn't sound like herself anymore. The clearing felt wrong. The air was thick, almost hard to breathe, and the humming noise was louder now, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. I didn't want to step further, but Dr. Hayes was already walking toward the circle of stones. Her movements were slow, almost dreamlike, as if she wasn't in control of her body anymore. "Dr. Hayes, stop!" I shouted, but she didn't even. "Look at me." Then I saw them. Tall figures emerged from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. They were just barely visible through the fog, massive, towering shapes that moved silently between the trees. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light like a predator's in the dark. There wasn't just one of them. There were several. Maybe a family, like Thomas Blackfoot had said. They didn't charge or growl or make any sound at all. They just stood there, watching us. It was worse than if they'd attacked because their stillness made them feel intelligent, like they knew exactly what they were doing. Dr. Hayes kept walking toward the stones, her arms outstretched like she was welcoming them. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "They're not here to hurt us." But I knew better. One of the creatures stepped forward, taller than the rest. Its body seemed to shimmer, blending with the fog and trees around it. It raised one long arm and pointed at Dr. Hayes. She froze mid-step, her head tilting unnaturally to one side as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Then it happened. Her body started to change. Slowly at first, then faster. Her arms stretched out like rubber bands, her legs bending backward at impossible angles. She didn't scream or fight it. She just stood there as her body folded in on itself, twisting into a shape that no human should ever take. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. All I could do was watch as she disappeared into nothing. One moment, she was there. The next, she was gone, folded into some kind of tear in reality that closed behind her like it had never existed. The creatures turned their glowing eyes on me then, and I knew I was next. I fumbled for my flare gun and fired it into the air. The bright light lit up the clearing and sent shadows dancing across the stones. The creatures recoiled from the fire, their shapes flickering like smoke caught in a gust of wind. That's when I remembered my medals, the ones I always carried, from my time in Korea. They were made of some kind of special alloy. I didn't know what exactly, but when I held them up, the creatures backed away even more. I ran. The forest seemed to twist and shift around me as I sprinted through the trees. No matter which way I turned, I kept ending up back at the same clearing with those cursed stones. It was like being trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Finally, I stopped running and forced myself to think. If this place was some kind of loop, maybe breaking my pattern would get me out. Instead of following a trail or trying to retrace my steps, I veered off into the thickest part of the forest where there wasn't even a path. The creatures followed me, silent but relentless. Their glowing eyes appeared and disappeared between the trees as they closed in on me. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. Then I saw it, the alpha. It stepped out from behind a massive tree directly in my path. This one was bigger than all the others, its body covered in matted fur that seemed to ripple with every movement. Its eyes weren't just glowing, they burned with an intensity that made me feel like it could see straight into my soul. I had no choice but to fight. I pulled out my father's hunting knife and lunged at the creature. It moved faster than anything that size should be able to, dodging my first strike with ease. But when I swung again, I managed to slash its arm. Thick black blood oozed from the wound and splattered onto my skin. The moment its blood touched me, everything changed. My vision blurred, and suddenly I wasn't in the forest anymore. I was somewhere else entirely. Flashes of strange landscapes filled my mind. Towering mountains made of crystal, skies that shifted colors like oil on water, and shadows moving across endless plains. The images were overwhelming, almost too much for my mind to handle. But then they were gone, and I was back in the forest again. The alpha let out a low growl, a sound so deep it felt like it came from inside my own chest, and disappeared into the fog along with the others. I didn't stop running until I collapsed from exhaustion. When I woke up, I was lying on the forest floor. My clothes were torn, my body aching like I'd been hit by a truck. The sun was rising, casting long shadows through the trees. At first, I thought I'd only been out for a few hours, but when I checked my watch, it wasn't working anymore. Then I noticed something even stranger. My map was crumpled in my pocket, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. The landmarks didn't look familiar anymore, and the directions seemed wrong. I stumbled through the woods until I found a trail marker. It said I was 27 miles from where the search party had started. There's no way I could have traveled that far on foot, not in one night. When the rescue team found me later that day, they said I'd been missing for 3 days. 3 days gone, and I couldn't remember a single thing after escaping the clearing. They asked about the others, Dr. Hayes, Walter, Philip, but all I could do was shake my head. "They're gone," I said quietly. The park administration buried the whole incident. Officially, the geology students and my team were listed as missing, with no further investigation planned. They didn't want to hear about shadow walkers or impossible footprints or strange symbols carved into the trees. But something had changed in me. A week after returning to my cabin, I noticed strange marks on my chest, symbols like the ones we'd seen at the campsite and on the standing stones. They weren't scars or scratches. They looked like they'd been burned into my skin somehow. No matter how hard I tried to forget what happened, those marks were a constant reminder. Then came the visions. At first, it was just small things, seeing flashes of places before actually arriving there or hearing sounds before they happened. But soon, it got worse. Time didn't feel linear anymore. Some days felt like they lasted forever. Others passed in an instant. Once, while patrolling a trail near the edge of the park, hikers swore they saw me standing deep in the forest. Even though I hadn't left my cabin that day, I don't know what those creatures did to me, or why they let me go when everyone else disappeared. Maybe it was because of my father's knife, or my medals from Korea. Or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that Olympic National Park isn't what people think it is. There are places in those woods where time bends and reality twists, places where you can lose yourself forever if you're not careful. And sometimes, late. At night when the wind is still and the shadows are long, I swear I can feel them watching me. My name is Margaret Holcomb, but everyone just calls me Maggie. I'm 42 years old and I've spent most of my life in the freezing wilderness of northern Minnesota. I'm a winter survival specialist, a former Olympic biathlon competitor, and a ranger for the Boundary Waters area. People say I'm tough, maybe too tough sometimes, but out here, you don't survive by being soft, you survive by being prepared. I live alone in a cabin I built myself, surrounded by emergency supplies, maps and tools for every situation. It's not that I don't like people. I've been married twice, but the wilderness has always been my real home. My Ojibwe grandmother used to say that the cold has its own spirit, and if you don't respect it, it'll take you. She wasn't. Wrong. It was early February when the storm hit. A record-breaking blizzard with temperatures dropping to 37 degrees and winds screaming at 60 miles per hour. The kind of weather that makes even seasoned rangers stay indoors. But I didn't have that option. The call came in over the radio just before sunset. A climate research team stationed deep in the Boundary Waters had sent out a distress signal. Their message was frantic, barely audible over the static. "We're stranded. Something's wrong. Please hurry." And then silence. I tried calling back, but there was no response, just dead air. The storm was already raging outside, and every instinct told me this wasn't going to be an ordinary rescue mission. Something felt off about their message, something desperate and unnatural. I grabbed my gear, heavy-duty snow boots, layers of thermal clothing, my survival pack, and my rifle. A vintage Winchester passed down through my family for generations. That rifle had saved me more times than I could count, and I wasn't about to leave it behind now. I assembled a team of 4 rangers: David Mitchell, Lisa Rodriguez, Alex Parker, and Sam Carter, all experienced in winter rescues. We knew the risks. We'd done this before. But as we loaded up the snowmobiles and headed into the storm's icy grip, I couldn't shake the feeling that this time was different. The wind howled like a living thing as we pushed forward through blinding snowdrifts. Halfway to the research station, we found something that stopped us cold. 2 abandoned snowmobiles sitting in the middle of the trail with no sign of their riders. David pointed to the ground nearby, his voice shaky. "Maggie." "What is that?" I followed his gaze and saw them. Tracks in the snow shaped like hearts but impossibly large, leading away from the vehicles into the woods. They weren't human tracks or animal tracks. They were something else entirely. Lisa whispered under her breath, "This doesn't feel right." She was right. It didn't feel right at all. The tracks in the snow were enough to make all of us uneasy. They were shaped like hearts, but they were huge, bigger than anything a human or animal could leave behind. The strangest part was how deep they sank into the snow, like whatever made them was impossibly heavy. I didn't say anything at first, but my mind went back to the stories my grandmother used to tell me about the winter hunger. She said it was an ancient spirit that came out during the coldest winters, feeding on people who were lost or starving. I never believed those stories as a kid, but standing there in the middle of a blizzard, staring at those tracks, I wasn't so sure anymore. "Let's keep moving," I said, trying to sound calm. "We don't have time to waste." We continued toward the research station, the wind biting at our faces and the cold sinking into our bones despite all our layers. The snowmobiles struggled against the deep drifts, and every few minutes we had to stop to clear ice from the engines. It felt like the storm itself was trying to stop us. About an hour later, David suddenly froze in place and turned his head toward the woods. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Hear what? Alex replied, looking around nervously. David's face was pale as he pointed toward the trees. It sounded like my sister, calling my name. I stopped breathing for a moment. David's sister had died 2 years ago in a car accident. He told me about it once during a long shift at the ranger station. There was no way he could have heard her voice out here in the middle of nowhere. "It's just the wind," I said firmly, hoping to snap him out of it. "Keep your focus." But David didn't look convinced. He kept glancing over his shoulder. As we pushed forward, his face growing more anxious by the minute. We finally reached a clearing where we found something that made my stomach drop. One of the researchers lying in the snow, frozen solid. His rib cage looked hollow, like something had scooped out everything inside him. His face was twisted into an expression of pure terror, his eyes wide open as if he'd seen something too horrible to comprehend. Lisa gasped and stepped back, covering her mouth with her gloved hand. "What could have done this?" she whispered. I didn't answer because I didn't know what to say. Instead, I crouched down and noticed strange symbols carved into a nearby tree, symbols that looked almost like writing but weren't any language I recognized. They seemed to shimmer slightly when I looked away, as if they were moving when no one was watching them closely. "This is bad," I muttered under my breath. Alex frowned at me. "What do you mean, bad? What's going on here?" I hesitated before answering. My grandmother used to warn me about things like this, things that come out during winters like this one. Lisa stared at me with wide eyes. "You're saying this is supernatural?" "I don't know what it is," I admitted honestly, "but whatever it is, we need to be careful." As we continued toward the research station, we found more signs that something was terribly wrong. Strange claw marks on trees that didn't match any animal we knew of. Shadows moving in the distance even though there shouldn't have been anyone else out here. And more of those heart-shaped tracks leading deeper into the woods. By now, everyone was on edge, especially David, who kept hearing his sister's voice calling out to him from somewhere just beyond our sight line. Finally, we reached another abandoned snowmobile with a stack of old newspaper clippings stuffed into its storage compartment. The headlines sent chills down my spine. Mysterious Deaths During Winter Storm, 1927. Hikers found hollowed out in Boundary Waters, 1943. Unexplained disappearances linked to Wendigo legend, 1956. The word Wendigo jumped out at me like a warning bell ringing in my head. By the time we found the abandoned hunting cabin, the storm had grown even worse. The wind was howling so loud it sounded like a scream, and the snow was coming down so hard we could barely see a few feet in front of us. We had no choice but to stop for shelter. If we kept going, we'd freeze to death before we made it to the research station. The cabin was old and falling apart, but it was better than nothing. The roof sagged under the weight of the snow, and the windows were cracked and frosted over. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and something faintly metallic. There was a fireplace, though, and enough dry firewood stacked in the corner to keep us warm for the night. We got a fire going quickly, but even with the flames roaring, the air inside felt wrong. It was colder than it should have been, like the heat wasn't reaching us properly. Lisa found an old journal tucked into one of the cabinets while she was searching for supplies. She flipped through it, her face growing more serious with each page she read. "This belongs to someone named Henry," she said quietly. "He wrote about seeing things in the woods during a bad winter back in 1956. "What kind of things?" Alex asked, his voice tight. Lisa hesitated before answering. "He called it the hunger. He said it wasn't human or animal, something ancient that feeds on people when they're starving or desperate." She looked up at me with wide eyes. "He mentioned heart-shaped tracks in the snow." I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Put that away," I said sharply. "We don't need to scare ourselves anymore than we already are." But deep down, I knew there was truth in what she'd read. The signs were all there. The tracks, the voices David kept hearing. And now, this journal. My grandmother's warnings echoed in my mind. The winter hunger comes when people are weak. It takes their bodies and their souls. That night, none of us slept well. The wind outside seemed to carry voices with it, faint whispers that sounded like people we knew but couldn't possibly be here. At one point, David got up and started sleepwalking toward the door. I grabbed him just in time and shook him awake. "What are you doing?" I demanded. I heard her again," he mumbled, his eyes glassy. "My sister. She's out there." "She's not out there," I said firmly, gripping his shoulders. "Whatever you're hearing, it's not real." But he didn't look convinced. Later that night, Lisa woke us all up with a scream. She'd gone through our food supplies and found some frozen meat missing, and David sitting by the fire with blood on his gloves and lips. "I don't remember doing it," he shouted when we confronted him. "I swear I don't." But his face told another story. He looked terrified of himself. The paranoia started creeping in after that. Alex accused David of putting everyone at risk. Lisa wouldn't stop clutching her rifle like she expected one of us to attack her at any moment, and Sam kept pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath about how none of this made sense. The worst part was when frost patterns began forming on the windows, patterns that looked eerily like human faces pressed against the glass from outside. "Maggie," Lisa whispered to me as we huddled by the fire later that night, "do you really think we'll make it out of this?" I didn't answer right away because I didn't know what to say. Finally, I told her the only thing I could. "We'll try." By morning, the storm hadn't let up. It was worse than ever. The wind slammed against the cabin like it wanted to tear it apart, and the snow was piled so high outside that the door barely opened. But we couldn't stay there any longer. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to wait for us to figure things out. We packed up and headed toward the research station, moving slower now because the snowmobiles were struggling in the deep drifts. David was quiet, his face pale and sunken, like he hadn't slept at all. Lisa kept glancing at him nervously, her rifle always within reach. Alex muttered something about how none of this felt real, but I didn't have time to reassure him. I just kept my focus on the trail ahead. When we finally reached the station, it was eerily intact. The building looked solid, with no signs of damage from the storm. The lights inside were still on, and we could hear the faint hum of equipment running, but there was no sign of the researchers. No movement, no voices, nothing. We stepped inside cautiously, our boots crunching on the icy floor. The air was freezing cold despite the heaters running full blast, and there was a strange buzzing sound coming from one of the labs. "Where is everyone?" Lisa whispered. "I don't know," I said, scanning the room. "Let's check the logs. They might have left something behind." The researchers had been recording video logs of their work, and we found them saved on a computer in one of the offices. The first few logs were normal, notes about weather patterns and electromagnetic anomalies caused by the storm. But as we clicked through them, things started to change. In one log, a researcher mentioned hearing voices outside during the night, voices that sounded like family members calling for help. Another log showed two researchers arguing about whether they should leave or stay. One of them looked terrified while the other seemed off somehow, like he wasn't entirely himself. The final log made my stomach turn. It showed one of the researchers sitting alone in front of the camera, speaking in multiple voices at once, his own voice mixed with others that sounded like children, women, men, all overlapping and distorted. His eyes were wide and empty, as he stared into the lens. "They're here," he said in a voice that wasn't entirely his own. "They're hungry." The screen went black after that. "What is this?" Alex asked, his voice shaking. "It's what I've been trying to warn you about," I said quietly. "It's not human. It's something older than us." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from outside, a sound like metal snapping in half. Alex ran out to check the perimeter while Lisa and I stayed inside with David, who was sitting slumped against a wall looking worse by the minute. Minutes passed before Alex came back, or so we thought it was Alex. His face was pale and frostbitten. His fingers and toes were blackened as if he'd been exposed to freezing temperatures for hours, despite being outside for only a few minutes. "I saw things," he whispered hoarsely as he stumbled inside. "They showed me things. Things I shouldn't have seen." Lisa backed away from him slowly while gripping her rifle tightly. "What do you mean, they? Who are they?" Alex didn't answer. He just stared at us with blank eyes before collapsing onto the floor. That's when David snapped. He lunged at Lisa without warning, knocking her to the ground and biting into her shoulder like an animal. She screamed and fought back as blood soaked through her jacket. I grabbed my rifle and hit David hard enough to knock him off her. "David!" I shouted as he lay on the ground gasping for air. "What's happening to you?" He didn't answer. He just looked at me with eyes that were starting to turn black around the edges. Lisa's wound wasn't normal either. The veins around it were turning dark and spreading quickly up her neck like an infection moving faster than it should have been possible. "We need to stop this," I said firmly as panic threatened to take over. "Whatever's out there, it's coming for us." One of the machines in the lab started beeping wildly then, a radar showing something. Massive, moving toward us through the storm outside. "It's bigger than a moose," Lisa whispered weakly as she looked at the screen. "It's coming right for us." The radar kept beeping, the signal growing stronger with every passing second. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. I could feel the air in the room change like the storm itself had seeped inside. The temperature dropped so fast that frost began forming on the walls, and my breath came out in thick clouds. "We need to barricade the doors," I said, trying to stay calm. "Now!" Alex was still unconscious on the floor, his fingers blackened from frostbite. Lisa was slumped against the wall, clutching her shoulder where David had bitten her. The veins around the wound were spreading fast, turning her skin dark and sickly. I didn't know how long she had left, but I couldn't think about that now. David sat in the corner, his head in his hands, muttering to himself. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were hollow. He wasn't David anymore. Not really. "Lisa," I said gently, kneeling beside her. "Can you still hold your rifle?" She nodded weakly, her hands trembling as she gripped it. "I'm not going down without a fight," she whispered. "Good," I said. "We're going to need all the help we can get." The first sound came from the roof, a heavy thud that made the whole building shudder. Then another, and another. It was like something massive was walking on top of us, testing the structure's strength. "It's here," Lisa said, her voice barely audible. The lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the radar screen, which now showed the entity right outside the station. Then came the voices. They started as whispers, soft and distant, before growing louder and more distinct. They were voices we recognized. Lisa's mother, Alex's wife, David's sister, even my grandmother. They called to us from outside begging for help. "Maggie." The voice was so clear it made my heart stop. It sounded exactly like my grandmother, her tone warm and familiar. "Maggie, come outside. It's safe here." I clenched my fists and shut my eyes tight. "It's not real," I whispered to myself. "It's not real." But David didn't believe that. He stood up suddenly and walked toward the door like he was in a trance. "I can hear her," he said softly. "She's out there. She needs me." "David!" "Stop!" I shouted, but it was too late. He opened the door, and a gust of icy wind blasted into the room, nearly knocking me off my feet. In that moment, I saw it, the Wendigo. It stood just beyond the doorway, towering over us like a nightmare brought to life. Its body was skeletal but impossibly strong. its skin stretched tight over sharp bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its eyes burned like embers in a frozen fire pit, and its mouth was filled with jagged teeth that glistened in the dim light. But what struck me most were its hands, long and clawed, and its feet shaped like hearts. David took one step toward it before it moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. In an instant, it grabbed him and dragged him into the storm. His screams were swallowed by the wind as if they'd never existed at all. Lisa screamed and fired her rifle at the doorway, but it was gone, vanished into the blizzard like a shadow dissolving into darkness. "We can't stay here," I shouted, over the howling wind. "It'll pick us off one by one. But where do we go?" Alex asked weakly from where he lay on the floor. I looked around desperately until my eyes landed on a box of silver nitrate samples sitting on one of the lab tables. The researchers must have been using them for some kind of experiment. Silver. My grandmother had always said silver could weaken spirits like this one, the Wendigo. And now I finally understood why those stories mattered. I grabbed one of the samples and quickly improvised a weapon by attaching it to an emergency flare gun I found in a supply cabinet. "This might be our only chance," I said as I loaded it carefully. The next few minutes were a blur of chaos. The Wendigo returned with a vengeance, slamming against the walls of the station until cracks began forming in the structure. It moved so fast we could barely track. One moment it was at a window, the next it was on the roof again. Lisa tried to fight back but collapsed halfway through reloading her rifle. The infection from David's bite had spread too far too quickly. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes and whispered 2 words. "I'm sorry." Then she turned on me, her body half transformed into something monstrous, and lunged forward with unnatural strength. I barely managed to grab an emergency flare from my pack and ignite it against her shoulder before she could reach me. The fire caught quickly, and she screamed, a sound that wasn't entirely human, as she fell back into a pile of equipment. There was no time to mourn her or anyone else. I had 1 shot left with my makeshift weapon, and I wasn't going to waste it. The Wendigo finally broke through into the radio room where I'd taken cover. It loomed over me like death itself, its burning eyes locked onto mine as if it could see straight into my soul. I raised the flare gun with shaking hands and recited an Ojibwe chant my grandmother had taught me long ago. A prayer for protection against evil spirits. The Wendigo hesitated for just a moment, enough time for me to fire. The silver nitrate hit its chest with a blinding flash of light, and for the first time since this nightmare began, it screamed in pain. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed what little supplies I could carry and set fire to the station using an emergency fuel canister before escaping through an underground tunnel meant for evacuations. 3 days later, a rescue team found me wandering through the woods half-frozen with severe frostbite on my right arm. It had to be amputated up to my elbow because of how badly infected it was. The official report blamed everything on environmental factors and group psychosis. No one believed my story about what really happened, not even when I showed them Lisa's bite marks or described David's last moments. But I know what I saw and what I fought, and every full moon since then has reminded me of that night, when my severed hand starts aching like it's still there, craving raw meat just like Lisa did before she turned. I don't live in Minnesota anymore. I transferred to Florida where winters are warm and quiet, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear their voices calling me back to those frozen woods where hunger waits for anyone foolish enough to wander too far into its grasp. My name is Thomas Wilson, and I've spent most of my life in the Monongahela National Forest, deep in the heart of West Virginia. I'm 53 years old now, but I've been walking these woods since I was a boy. My father and grandfather were ridge runners, men who knew every hollow, every cave, and every hidden trail in these mountains. They taught me everything I know. For a while, I followed in their footsteps, running moonshine through these hills. It wasn't exactly legal, but it's what we did to survive. That all changed 12 years ago when the law finally caught up with me. Instead of sending me to prison, they offered me a deal. Take a job as a forest ranger and keep an eye on these woods legally. It wasn't an easy choice, but I took it. I've been patrolling these same trails ever since. Life out here is quiet, for the most part. The forest has its own rhythm. Birds singing at dawn, deer moving through the underbrush, and the wind whispering through the pines. I know this place like the back of my hand. Every sound, every smell, it's all familiar, to me. At least, it used to be. You see, something changed recently. It started with small things. Campers complaining about strange noises at night and hunters saying they felt like they were being watched. At first, I chalked it up to their imaginations. The forest can play tricks on you if you're not used to it. But then, well, things got stranger. One night, a couple of hikers came into my station looking pale as ghosts. They said they'd heard howling, loud and deep, coming from all directions at once. They swore it wasn't wolves or coyotes. It sounded too unnatural. I told them not to worry and sent them on their way, but something about their story stuck with me. The next day, I decided to check out the area where they'd been camping. As I walked through the forest, everything felt off. The usual sounds of birds and insects were gone. It was dead silent. That's when I found the first set of tracks. They were big, too big for any animal I'd ever seen out here, and they had 5 long claw marks in a pattern that didn't make sense. Whatever made those tracks wasn't walking on 4 legs, like a bear or a mountain lion. It was walking upright, like a man. I'll admit it, I felt a chill run down my spine when I saw those tracks, but I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe some prankster was out here trying to scare people. I couldn't have been more wrong. The next few days passed quietly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The forest didn't feel the same anymore. It was like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, late one evening, I got a call from a group of campers who'd set up near the old logging trails. They sounded panicked, saying they'd heard howling again, this time louder and closer than before. They swore they saw shadows moving through the trees, but when they shined their flashlights, there was nothing there. I told them to stay put and keep their campfire going while I came to check things out. By the time I reached their campsite, they were already packing up to leave. Their faces were pale and their hands shook as they stuffed sleeping bags into backpacks. One of them, a young guy with glasses, grabbed my arm and said, "You've got to do something about this. There's something out there, watching us." I looked around the campsite. The fire was burning low, casting long shadows across the clearing. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but then I noticed something odd. The woods surrounding the campsite were completely silent. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, just silence. I told the campers I'd stay behind and look around while they headed back to their cars. Once they were gone, I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the direction they said the howling had come from. The deeper I went into the forest, the stranger things became. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of claw marks on tree trunks, long and deep, like something had raked its nails across them. The tracks I'd seen earlier weren't just isolated. There were more of them now, scattered along the trail in a way that didn't make sense. Then I heard it, the howling. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard before. It was low and guttural at first, almost like a growl, but then it rose into a high-pitched wail that made my skin crawl. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off every surface until it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. I froze in place, gripping my flashlight so tight my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the woods around me. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but all I could see were trees and shadows. And then I saw them. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, a pair of glowing yellow dots in the distance. But as they moved closer, I realized they weren't dots at all. They were eyes. big, round eyes that seemed to shimmer in the dark. Didn't wait to find out what those eyes belonged to. My instincts took over, and I turned back toward the ranger station as fast as my legs could carry me. When I got back to the station, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My mind raced with questions. What had I just seen? Was it some kind of animal? Or was it something else entirely? That night, I couldn't sleep. The howling echoed in my ears long after it had stopped, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing yellow eyes staring back at me. The next morning, I woke up to find the ranger station in complete disarray. My desk was overturned, papers scattered everywhere, and the wooden door frame had deep claw marks gouged into it. Whatever had been out there last night, it had come here. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the damage. My first thought was a bear, but I knew better. I'd seen bear attacks before. This wasn't one of them. The claw marks were too big, too precise. And the weirdest part? There weren't any tracks leading up to the station or away from it. It was like whatever did this had just vanished. I tried using the radio to call for backup, but all I got was static. Then, through the static, I heard something else. A low growl, faint but unmistakable. It sent a shiver down my spine. I turned the radio off and decided to take matters into my own hands. I grabbed my walking stick, it's an old thing I carved myself years ago, and headed out to investigate. If something was stalking these woods, I needed to find out what it was before anyone else got hurt. As I walked the trails, I started noticing more signs that something wasn't right. Trees had been scratched up in strange patterns, almost like symbols or markings. Piles of animal bones, deer mostly, were scattered in odd arrangements, like someone or something had placed them there on purpose. That's when I ran into Martin Delacroix. Martin's an old hunter who's lived in these parts his whole life. He's one of the few people who knows these woods as well as I do. When he saw me, he waved me over and said, "Thomas, you're not going to believe what I've seen." He told me he'd been out near the old mining area when he spotted something moving through the trees, something tall and fast. It wasn't a bear, he said firmly, and it wasn't no man either. I told him about the claw marks at the station and the tracks I'd found earlier. He nodded grimly and said, "You ever hear of the dogmen?" I shook my head. "Dogmen? What are you talking about?" Martin leaned closer and lowered his voice like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "They're old legends around here," he said. "Creatures that look like wolves but walk on two legs like men. My granddaddy used to tell me stories about 'em. Said they've been around since before settlers came to these mountains." I wanted to laugh it off as just another campfire tale, but after everything I'd seen, I couldn't dismiss it so easily. Martin offered to help me investigate further, and even though I knew it was risky, I agreed. 2 pairs of eyes were better than 1. We decided to check out the abandoned coal mine first. It was one of the few places deep enough in the forest where something could hide without being disturbed for years. As we approached the entrance, a strange smell hit us, like wet fur mixed with rotting meat. It was so strong it made my stomach turn. Inside the mine, we found more signs that something, or someone, had been there recently. Fresh claw marks. On the walls, piles of bones arranged in circles, and strange scratches on the rocks that looked almost like writing. Martin pointed to one of the symbols and said, "My granddaddy used to talk about these too. Said they were boundary markers, warnings to stay out." That's when it hit me. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't just wandering aimlessly through the forest. They were marking their territory. As we left the mine, Martin stopped, suddenly, and pointed toward a clearing up ahead. "Look," he whispered. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed them, shapes moving between the trees. They were fast and quiet, barely more than shadows in the fading light. "Stay low," Martin said as he crouched behind a fallen log. We watched as one of the creatures stepped into view for just a moment. a tall figure covered in dark fur with glowing yellow eyes and long claws that glinted in the sunlight. It looked right at us. My heart felt like it stopped as those glowing eyes locked onto mine. For a second, neither of us moved. Then Martin grabbed my arm and whispered urgently, "Run!" We didn't stop running until we were back at my truck parked near the ranger station. Both of us were out of breath and shaken to our cores. "Thomas," Martin said finally, his voice trembling slightly, "whatever those things are, they're not just animals." I nodded silently because deep down, I already knew he was right. After what we saw near the mine, neither Martin nor I could pretend this was just some wild animal. Whatever those creatures were, they were smart. Too smart. And they weren't afraid of us. That night, I stayed up going through old records kept at the station. Rangers before me had written detailed logs about everything from bear sightings to forest fires. But as I flipped through the dusty pages, I found something that stopped me cold. It was an entry from 1932. The ranger who wrote it, someone named Edward Hale, described hearing strange howling sounds near the same mining area Martin and I had just visited. He mentioned finding claw marks on trees and piles of animal bones arranged in patterns. But the part that really got me was this. Hale claimed he'd seen figures with wolf-like faces, watching him from the shadows. I sat back in my chair, staring at the page. This wasn't new. These things had been here for decades. Maybe even longer. The next morning, Martin came by with more bad news. A group of local hunters had found one of their dogs dead near the edge of the forest. Its body had been torn apart, and its insides were missing. They said it looked like something had gutted it with precision, not like a bear or coyote attack. "They're getting bolder," Martin said grimly. "Whatever's out there, it's not just staying in the deep woods anymore." I nodded, but before I could respond, my radio crackled to life. It was Patrick Moore, one of the junior rangers who worked under me. His voice was shaky as he said, "Thomas, I think there's something out here with me." "Where are you?" I asked quickly. "I'm on the North Trail," he replied. "I was checking on a campsite when I heard something. It's been following me for the past 10 minutes." "Stay where you are," I said firmly. "I'm coming to get you." Martin and I grabbed our gear and headed out immediately. The North Trail wasn't far from the station, but when we got there, Patrick was gone. We found his flashlight lying in the dirt along with his badge and a torn piece of his uniform. There were claw marks on the ground leading into the trees, but no sign of him anywhere. Martin swore under his breath as he scanned the area with his rifle ready. "This ain't normal," he muttered. "Not even close." I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. Patrick was just a kid, barely out of college, and now he was missing because I hadn't taken this seriously enough from the start. We searched for hours, calling his name and following every lead we could find, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. As night fell, we made our way back to the station in silence. The forest felt heavier than usual, like it was pressing down on us from all sides. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. Back at the station, I poured myself a drink from my personal stash of moonshine, something I hadn't done in years, and tried to make sense of everything that had happened. That's when Martin spoke up. "You ever hear about the pact?" he asked suddenly. I shook my head. "What's that?" "It's an old story," he said slowly. "My granddaddy told me about it when I was a boy. Back when settlers first came to these mountains, they made a deal with something in the forest. They agreed to stay out of certain areas, places like that mine we went to, in exchange for being left alone." "And you think these creatures are part of that?" I asked skeptically. Martin shrugged. "I don't know what to think anymore, Thomas, but if there was a pact, maybe it's been broken." His words stuck with me long after he left for the night. Around midnight, I heard movement outside the station, soft footsteps crunching through the gravel driveway. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. The beam of light swept across the clearing, and landed on a pair of glowing yellow eyes staring back at me from just beyond the tree line. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, more eyes appeared, 7 pairs in total, all watching me silently from the shadows. I stepped back inside and locked the door, my hand shaking as I bolted it shut. Whatever these things were planning, it wasn't good. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. It was the park administration calling to check in. I told them about Patrick's disappearance, the claw marks, and the strange eyes I'd seen watching me from the woods. But instead of taking me seriously, they brushed it off. "Thomas, it's probably just a bear," my supervisor said. "You know how people get when they're out in the woods too long. They start imagining things." I wanted to argue, but I knew it wouldn't help. They weren't here. They hadn't seen what I'd seen. After hanging up, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't wait for backup that might never come. If these creatures were expanding their territory, and if Patrick was still alive, I had to act fast. Martin showed up later that day with his hunting gear and a determined look on his face. "I'm not letting you go out there alone," he said firmly. "Whatever's out there, we'll face it together." We started by retracing Patrick's steps, following the claw marks deeper into the forest than we'd ever gone before. The silence was unnerving. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our boots crunching against the dirt. As we moved further in, we found more signs of the creatures. Trees marked with fresh scratches, piles of bones arranged in spirals, and strange symbols carved into rocks. It was like they were leaving messages, warnings for anyone who dared enter their territory. Then we found something that stopped us cold, an old burial ground hidden deep in the woods. The graves were marked with crude wooden crosses and silver, pendants that looked centuries old. But many of the pendants had been removed recently, some of them lying broken on the ground. Martin knelt down to examine one of the pendants and muttered, "This can't be good." "What do you mean?" I asked. He pointed to the broken silver pieces. "My granddaddy always said silver was important, said it could keep these creatures away. If someone disturbed this place, maybe that's why they're angry." It made sense in a way I didn't want to admit. The recent dam construction near the forest had brought more people into these mountains than ever before. Hikers, campers, workers, and now these creatures seemed to be pushing back. As we stood there, trying to make sense of it all, a low growl echoed through the trees. It wasn't far away. Martin raised his rifle and whispered, "Stay close." We moved carefully through the forest, following the growling sounds until we reached another clearing. That's when we saw them, 7 figures standing in a loose circle around something on the ground. At first, I couldn't tell what they were doing. Then I realized they were surrounding Patrick. He was lying on his back, barely moving, his uniform torn and bloodied. One of the creatures, a large one with dark fur and glowing yellow eyes, stood over him like it was guarding him. Martin raised his rifle to take aim at the creature, but before he could fire, another one lunged at him from behind. The next few seconds were chaos. Martin fired a shot that echoed through the woods as I swung my walking stick at one of the creatures charging toward me. They were fast, too fast, and their growls seemed to vibrate in my chest like thunder. Martin screamed, as one of them grabbed him by the arm and dragged him into the trees. I tried to follow, but another creature blocked my path, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. I swung my stick again and managed to hit it hard enough to knock it back for a moment. Then I grabbed Patrick and started running as fast as I could toward a nearby cave, a place I knew well from my moonshining days. The cave was small but deep enough to hide us for a while. As soon as we got inside, I set Patrick down against the wall and checked his wounds. He was alive, but barely conscious. Outside, I could hear them growling and scratching at the rocks near the entrance. They knew we were inside. They were just waiting for us to come out. That's when I remembered something. Moonshine. Years ago, when I was still running shine through these mountains, My grandfather told me about certain herbs that could keep animals away from our stills, wild garlic and wormwood mostly. But he also said moonshine itself could do more than just scare off animals if it was strong enough. Pulled out a flask from my bag, the same moonshine I'd been drinking since this whole mess started, and poured some onto a rag before stuffing it into an empty bottle from my pack. "Stay here," I told Patrick as I lit the rag on fire and threw it toward the entrance of the cave. The fire flared up quickly, filling the air with smoke and fumes that made my eyes water. Outside, I heard them growling louder, angry but retreating. It wasn't much of a victory, but it bought us time. The moon was high in the sky by the time the growling outside the cave finally stopped. I waited a few minutes, listening carefully, to make sure they were gone, before stepping out into the night. The forest was quiet again, but it didn't feel safe. It felt like they were still watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. Patrick was too weak to move on his own, so I left him hidden in the cave and promised I'd come back for him. I didn't want to leave him, but I knew I had to do something to stop these creatures before they hurt anyone else. I headed toward the old church at the edge of the forest, a place I hadn't visited in years. It was abandoned now, but back when my wife was alive, we used to go there every Sunday. She loved that church. It felt like the one place in these mountains where nothing bad could happen. When I got there, the church was just as I remembered it, small and weathered, with its bell tower rising above the trees like a watchful guardian. But tonight, it felt different. The air around it was heavy, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed darker than usual. I stepped inside and started setting up my plan. The creatures hated my moonshine. I'd seen that much already, so I poured what was left of my stash onto the wooden floorboards near the entrance and around the bell tower stairs. If they came for me here, I'd make sure they regretted it. As I worked, I heard movement outside, soft footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves. My heart raced as I grabbed my walking stick and climbed up into the bell tower. From there, I could see them approaching through the trees, 7 figures moving silently toward the church. At the front of the pack was the alpha, the biggest one with dark fur and glowing yellow eyes. It carried itself differently than the others, more confident, more dangerous. I rang the church bell as hard as I could, hoping to scare them off or at least disorient them. The sound echoed through the forest like a warning shot, but instead of retreating, they moved faster, closing in on me from all sides. The alpha reached the door first and stepped inside without hesitation. Its glowing eyes scanned the room, before locking onto me in the bell tower. It growled low and deep, a sound that made my chest tighten, and then started climbing up toward me. I swung my walking stick at it as hard as I could when it reached me, but it barely flinched. Its claws raked across my chest, tearing through my shirt and skin like paper. The pain was blinding, but I didn't stop fighting. I grabbed my flask, the last bit of moonshine I had, and forced it into its mouth before lighting a match and throwing it onto its fur. The fire spread quickly, engulfing its body in flames, as it howled in agony. The sound was deafening, a mix of rage and pain that echoed through the night. The other creatures froze for a moment as their alpha burned, then scattered into the woods like frightened animals. Without their leader's mental control, they seemed lost, confused. I collapsed onto the floor of the bell tower, blood pouring from my wounds as the flames died down around me. My vision blurred as darkness closed in, but before I passed out completely, I saw something strange, blue light glowing faintly from where its claws had cut me. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold floor of the church. The first thing I felt was pain, sharp and deep, radiating from the claw marks across my chest. The second thing I noticed was the silence. The creatures were gone. I forced myself to sit up, wincing as every movement sent a wave of pain through my body. The bell tower was scorched from the fire and the air smelled like smoke and burnt fur. My walking stick was lying next to me, charred but still intact. I grabbed it and used it to pull myself to my feet. Outside the church, the forest felt different. The heavy, suffocating air was gone, replaced by a strange stillness. It wasn't peaceful. It was more like the woods were waiting for something. I stumbled back to the cave where I'd left Patrick. He was still there, alive but barely conscious. His eyes fluttered open when he saw me, and he whispered weakly, "Did you stop them?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. The alpha was dead, but the others had scattered into the woods. I didn't know if they'd come back or if killing their leader had broken whatever bond held them together. With Patrick leaning on me for support, we made our way back to the ranger station. Every step felt like a battle against my own body, but I couldn't stop, not until we were safe. When we finally reached the station, I radioed for help again. This time, someone answered. Within an hour, a team arrived to take Patrick to the hospital and check out my injuries. I told them everything about the creatures, the mine, the burial ground, but they didn't believe me. Thomas, my supervisor, said gently as he looked at my wounds, "You've been through a lot. Maybe your mind is just playing tricks on you." I wanted to argue, but I didn't have the energy. They hadn't seen what I'd seen. They hadn't heard those growls or felt those glowing eyes watching them from the shadows. After they left, I sat alone in the station and looked down at my chest where the alpha had clawed me. The wounds were deep and jagged, but there was something strange about them. They glowed faintly under the moonlight. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or a trick of the light, but as days turned into weeks, I realized it wasn't. Going away. Every full moon, the scars burned like fire and glowed with that eerie blue light. It wasn't just physical pain. It was something deeper. Every time those scars burned, I felt connected to something in the woods. Like they were still watching me, still waiting for me to make a move. I spent the rest of my career mapping out every strange symbol and boundary marker in those mountains. I avoided the burial ground and warned others to stay away from certain areas of the forest, even if they didn't believe me. Occasionally, hikers or hunters would report seeing shadows moving through the trees or hearing howling at night. They'd come to me for answers, but all I could do was tell them to stay out of those woods after dark. When I finally retired years later, I decided to go back one last time, to hunt down whatever remained of that pack and end this once and for all. I disappeared during that hunt. Some say I got lost in those mountains and died alone out there. Others say those creatures found me and dragged me into their world forever. But if you ask me, well, let's just say some scars never heal. My name is Elijah Monroe. I'm a ranger here in the Okefenokee Swamp, Georgia. It's not just a job for me, it's my home, my history, and my legacy. My family has lived near this swamp for generations. My great-grandfather, a former slave, found freedom here, hiding in its thick, shadowy embrace. My grandfather was one of the first black rangers during segregation, though he was never officially recognized. And now, here I am, following in their footsteps. I wasn't always here. For 10 years, I worked in National Park Administration far away from this place. But something kept pulling me back, like the swamp itself was calling me. So I returned, even though it cost me my marriage. My ex-wife couldn't understand why I'd leave behind a comfortable life to come back to this remote, humid wilderness. But this swamp, it's more than just a place to me. It's alive. It breathes. It whispers secrets that only those who listen closely can hear. I carry an antique compass with me everywhere I go. It belonged to my great-grandfather, the same man who found freedom here. The needle doesn't always point north. Sometimes it spins wildly, like it's confused or trying to tell me something. My grandmother used to say it was connected to the swamp itself, guiding our family through its mysteries. When I returned to the swamp, things felt different, off somehow. The drought had been dragging on for months, and the water levels were lower than I'd ever seen them. The air felt heavier, thicker, like it was hiding something. And then there was the mist. It started a few weeks ago, thin at first, barely, noticeable, but it didn't act like normal fog. It moved against the wind and clung to certain areas of the swamp like it had a mind of its own. At night, it seemed to glow faintly, like moonlight trapped inside it. I tried not to think too much about it at first. After all, I've seen strange things in this swamp before, unusual animal behavior, plants growing where they shouldn't be. But this felt different. One evening, as I was patrolling near the water's edge, I noticed something odd. The mist was swirling in tight circles over the surface of the water, creating ripples that spread outward like someone had thrown a stone into the pond. But there was no wind and no movement nearby, just me and my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I crouched down to get a better look when I heard it. A low vibration that wasn't quite a sound but something I could feel deep in my chest. It made my ribs ache and my stomach churn. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding harder with each step. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying what I'd seen and felt, the mist moving on its own, the ripples in the water, that strange vibration that seemed to come from nowhere. The next morning, Marcus Daniels, my partner and fellow ranger, came by my cabin before heading out for water sampling duties. Marcus is younger than me, but sharp as a tack when it comes to tracking and identifying wildlife patterns in the swamp. "I've been noticing some weird stuff out there," he said as he packed his gear into his boat. "Fog moving funny, animals acting skittish. You think it's just the drought messing with things?" I didn't want to scare him with my own thoughts about what might be happening, so I just nodded and told him to keep an eye out for anything unusual. But later, that afternoon, Marcus didn't come back. His boat was found drifting near the shore with all his equipment still inside, his GPS tracker blinking steadily and his water sampling tools neatly arranged like he'd been interrupted mid-task. There were footprints leading away from the boat, half human but with long toes and webbed impressions like something amphibious had walked there. I stared at those footprints for what felt like hours before finally radioing for help. The search for Marcus started the next morning. A few rangers, a couple of local police officers, and I headed out to the spot where his boat had been found. The footprints were still there, clear as day. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew those tracks weren't made by any animal we'd ever seen in this swamp, or anywhere else. I kept my thoughts to myself as we spread out to look for clues. The air was thick with humidity, and the mist seemed heavier than usual, swirling low to the ground like it was watching us. Every now and then, I'd feel that strange vibration again, a deep hum that wasn't a sound but more like a pressure in my chest. One of the officers called out from the water's edge, "Hey, you need to see this." We rushed over and found Marcus's flashlight lying half submerged in the mud. It was still on, its beam cutting through the fog like a knife. But what caught my attention wasn't the flashlight. It was the water around it. The surface was rippling in slow, steady waves, even though there was no wind and nothing moving nearby. "Could be an alligator," someone muttered, but I shook my head. I've lived in this swamp long enough to know what an alligator looks like when it moves through water. This wasn't that. We searched until sunset, but found no other signs of Marcus. Not his hat, not his boots, not even a scrap of clothing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the mist grew thicker, wrapping around us like a blanket. The vibrations grew stronger too, making my ribs ache with every step I took. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Something just beyond the edge of my vision, hidden in the mist. My grandmother's stories came rushing back to me, the ones she used to tell when I was a kid sitting at her feet by the fire. She'd talk about the ones who walk between worlds, ancient beings that lived deep in the swamp where no one dared to go. She said they could change shape and dissolve into mist, slipping through cracks and shadows like smoke. They were guardians of something older than time itself, and they only woke up when something disturbed their home, like a drought or a flood or people messing with things they shouldn't be messing with. I never believed her stories back then, thought they were just tales meant to scare kids into staying close to home. But now Now, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I went to visit her at her house on the edge of town. She was old now, her hair white as snow and her hands trembling as she poured me a cup of tea. But her mind was as sharp as ever. "You've seen them," she said before I could even tell her why I'd come. Her voice was calm but heavy with meaning, like she already knew everything I was about to say. I nodded slowly and told her about Marcus's disappearance, about the footprints and the mist and the vibrations that seemed to follow me everywhere. I went. She didn't seem surprised. In fact, she looked almost sad as she reached for an old leather-bound book sitting on her kitchen table. She opened it carefully, flipping through pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches until she found what she was looking for. A drawing of a creature with webbed hands and glowing eyes surrounded by misty swirls. "They've been here longer than we have," she said softly, tracing her finger over the drawing. "Longer than this swamp has been a swamp." She handed me a bundle of dried herbs tied together with twine and told me how to use them. Burn them in a circle around myself if I ever felt threatened by the walkers. She also gave me an old compass that looked almost identical to mine, but had strange symbols etched into its casing. "This belonged to your great-grandfather," she said quietly. "He used it to find his way through their territory without getting lost." I took the compass and herbs without saying a word, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to ask, or if I even wanted answers to. The next day, a search party was organized. It wasn't just rangers anymore, and this time we had a mix of people. Sergeant Howard Reynolds from the local police joined us. He was skeptical about everything, brushing off the strange footprints as mud playing tricks on us. Dr. Julia Martinez, an environmental scientist studying the effects of the drought, came along too. She was curious about the unusual patterns in the water and wanted to take samples. Then there was Timothy Johnson, a local guide who claimed he'd seen things in the swamp before. Most folks thought he was just telling tall tales to scare tourists, but I could tell he believed what he was saying. And finally, there was Nathan, my estranged cousin. We hadn't spoken in years, not since a family argument that split us apart. But when he heard about Marcus's disappearance, he showed up at my cabin unannounced. "You know what this is?" he said as soon as I opened the door. His voice was low and serious, his eyes darting around like he expected something to jump out of the shadows. I didn't answer him right away, but I let him join the search party. If anyone else understood what might be happening out there, it was Nathan. Our grandmother had told him the same stories she'd told me, maybe even more. We set out early in the morning, our boats cutting through the still water as the mist hung low around us. The swamp was eerily quiet. No birds calling, no frogs croaking, just the soft splash of our paddles and that ever-present hum vibrating in my chest. After a few hours of searching, we stumbled upon something none of us expected. A cluster of old buildings half sunken into the swamp. They looked like they'd been abandoned for over a century. Weathered wood covered in moss and vines, but there were signs that someone or something had been there recently. One of the cabins had a door hanging open, and inside we found strange markings carved into the walls, symbols that looked almost like hieroglyphics but weren't any language I recognized. Dr. Martinez took pictures while Timothy muttered prayers, under his breath, clutching a small wooden cross around his neck. "This place shouldn't be here," Nathan said quietly as we explored further. "It's not on any map." We found more clues as we pressed on. Plants growing in unnatural patterns, their roots twisting together like they were alive. Water samples Dr. Martinez collected that shimmered with an oily sheen. And then, more footprints. These ones were fresher than the ones by Marcus's boat, and there were more of them too, leading deeper into the swamp where the mist grew thicker and darker. That night, we set up camp on a small patch of dry land surrounded by water on all sides. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but we were all scared. Even Sergeant Reynolds, who'd spent most of the day rolling his eyes at Timothy's stories about swamp spirits, seemed uneasy as he stood watch with his flashlight scanning the foggy darkness. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound, a faint whispering that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding as I strained to hear what it was saying. But it wasn't words exactly. It was more like voices overlapping each other in a strange rhythm that made my skin crawl. Then came the scream. It was Sergeant Reynolds' voice, loud and panicked, followed by splashing and thrashing sounds coming from the water's edge, where he'd been standing watch. We rushed out of our tents with flashlights and weapons drawn, but by the time we got there, all we found was his flashlight lying in the mud, and something else. The ground where he'd been standing was covered in patches of what looked like scales, shiny and greenish-black like a snake's skin, but they weren't just lying there. They were growing out of the mud itself. Dr. Martinez reached down to touch one of them with her gloved hand but yanked it back immediately when it started spreading up her glove like wildfire. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Nobody had an answer. Nathan pulled me aside while everyone else tried to figure out what to do next. "We need to leave," he said firmly. "Now." "We can't," I replied just as firmly. "Not without finding Marcus." Nathan grabbed my arm and looked me straight in the eye. "Elijah," he said softly but urgently, "you know what's happening here. I didn't want to. Admit it. Not to him, not to myself. But deep down, I knew he was right." The next morning, the mist was thicker than ever. It wrapped around us like a living thing, muffling sounds and making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The swamp felt different, heavier somehow, like the air itself was pressing down on us. We decided to follow the fresh footprints deeper into the swamp, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn back. Nathan stayed close to me, his eyes darting around like he expected something to jump out of the mist at any moment. Timothy led the way, his hand gripping his wooden cross so tightly his knuckles were white. "I've seen this before," he muttered under his breath. "Years ago, when I was just a kid." "What did you see?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stopped walking and turned to look at me, his face pale and drawn. "Things that weren't human," he said simply. "Things that looked like people but weren't." Nobody said anything after that. We just kept walking, our footsteps crunching softly on the damp ground as the mist swirled around us. Eventually, we came to a clearing, a small patch of land surrounded by water on all sides. In the center of the clearing was something that made my stomach drop. Marcus's jacket, draped over a twisted tree branch like a flag. I ran forward without thinking, grabbing the jacket and looking around desperately for any sign of him. That's when I heard it, a voice calling my name from somewhere deep in the mist. "Elijah." It was Marcus's voice, but something about it was wrong. Too smooth, too calm, like it wasn't really him speaking. "Elijah, come closer." I froze in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The others gathered around me, their faces pale and tense as they listened to the voice echoing through the mist. "Marcus?" I called out hesitantly. "Where are you?" The voice laughed softly, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine. "I'm here," it said simply. "Come find me." Nathan grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the group. "Don't listen to it," he hissed urgently. "It's not him." Before I could respond, something moved in the mist. A shadowy figure that looked almost human, but wasn't quite right. Its limbs were too long, its movements too smooth, and its eyes glowed faintly like fireflies trapped in glass jars. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, more shadows appeared behind it, dozens of them, all moving in perfect sync like they were part of one being instead of separate creatures. Timothy dropped his cross and fell to his knees, whispering prayers under his breath as tears streamed down his face. Dr. Martinez tried to take a sample of the mist with her equipment, but screamed when her hands started trembling uncontrollably as soon as she touched it. Nathan pulled out a small pouch of herbs, similar to the ones our grandmother had given me, and began scattering them in a circle around us while muttering an old family prayer under his breath. The shadows stopped moving for a moment, their glowing eyes fixed on him as if they recognized what he was doing. But then they started moving again, faster this time, closing in on us with unnatural speed. Timothy stood up suddenly and ran toward them, shouting at us to get away while he created a distraction. "Go!" he yelled over his shoulder as he disappeared into the mist. We didn't have time to argue. We ran as fast as we could back toward our boats, the sound of Timothy's screams echoing behind us until they were abruptly cut off. When we finally reached the boats, Dr. Martinez was gone too, her blood trail leading into the water where ripples spread outward in slow circles. Nathan grabbed my arm again and looked me straight in the eye. "This is it," he said firmly. "We have to end this now." I nodded slowly and pulled out my grandmother's compass and herbs. Together, we headed back into the mist toward our family's ancestral burial ground, the only place I knew that might offer protection against. Whatever these things were, the burial ground was deep in the swamp, hidden in a place only my family knew how to find. It wasn't much, just a small clearing surrounded by ancient trees, with simple wooden markers sticking out of the ground. But it felt sacred, like the air itself was different here. Calmer, quieter, safer. Nathan and I stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by mist that seemed to pulse and shift like it was alive. The shadows were closing in fast, their glowing eyes flickering in the darkness like candles in the wind. I pulled out the bundle of herbs my grandmother had given me and started scattering them in a wide circle around us, just like she'd taught me. Nathan added his own herbs to the mix, muttering prayers under his breath as he worked. The mist recoiled slightly as the herbs burned, but it didn't stop moving. It just slowed down, circling us like a predator waiting for its moment to strike. Then I saw him, Marcus, standing at the edge of the clearing. He looked almost normal at first glance, but as he stepped closer, I could see the changes. His skin was covered in patches of scales that shimmered faintly in the dim light, and his eyes glowed with that same eerie light as the shadows behind him. "Elijah," he said softly, his voice layered with other voices that echoed and overlapped, like a choir singing out of sync. "It's not too late. You can join us." I froze in place, my hands trembling as I stared at him. It was Marcus, my friend, but it wasn't him anymore. Nathan grabbed my shoulder and shook me hard. "Don't. Listen to him," he shouted. "It's not real." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his glowing eyes fixed on Nathan. "You don't understand," he said calmly. "We're not here to hurt you. We're here to protect this place, to keep it alive." The shadows moved closer, their forms shifting and dissolving into mist as they surrounded us completely. The vibrations grew stronger, making my ribs ache and my head spin until I thought I might pass out. I remembered my grandmother's grimoire, the old leather-bound book she'd shown me, and the incantations written inside it. I didn't know if they would work or if I was just grasping at straws, but I had to try. I closed my eyes and started chanting softly, repeating the words over and over until they felt like they were coming from somewhere deep inside me instead of just my mouth. The mist hesitated for a moment, just long enough for me to feel a flicker of hope, but then it surged forward again with renewed force. Nathan pulled out his compass, the one our grandmother had given him, and held it high above his head. The symbols etched into its casing began to glow faintly as he whispered another prayer under his breath. The mist recoiled again, this time more violently, swirling away from us like smoke caught in a strong wind. Marcus screamed, a sound that was both human and not, and lunged toward Nathan with unnatural speed. Nathan threw himself backward just in time to avoid Marcus's grasp, but dropped his compass in the process. I grabbed it before Marcus could reach it and held it tightly in my hands as I continued chanting. The mist began to dissolve slowly, but steadily, until only Marcus was left standing there alone. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Anger? Sadness? Regret? Before turning and walking back into the swamp without another word. When he disappeared into the darkness, everything went still. The mist vanished completely, and the vibrations stopped. Nathan and I stood there for what felt like hours before, finally making our way back to our boats. 3 days later, I woke up in my cabin with no memory of how I'd gotten there or what had happened after Marcus disappeared. Nathan was gone too. Nobody had seen him since that night, and all physical evidence of what we'd encountered had vanished without a trace. The footprints were gone. Dr. Martinez's samples were missing. Even Timothy's cross had disappeared from where he'd dropped it. I tried to tell someone what had happened, to explain why Marcus was still missing, but every time I opened my mouth to speak about it, my throat tightened painfully until I couldn't say another word. Over time, strange things started happening to me. I could predict weather patterns with perfect accuracy, even storms that came out of nowhere, but I couldn't explain how I knew them. And then there were the scales, small patches of shimmering skin that appeared between my fingers during full moons before fading away again. I knew what they meant. That part of me had been changed forever, but I didn't dare tell anyone about them. Now I spend most of my days patrolling the swamp like nothing ever happened. But during drought seasons, when the mist starts creeping back into familiar places, I perform secret rituals using my grandmother's herbs and prayers to keep the walkers dormant. Sometimes, late at night when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I see Marcus standing at the edge of the water, watching me silently before disappearing again into the mist. My name is Michael Reeves. I'm 37 years old, and I've spent most of my life exploring caves. You could say it's my calling. I've been everywhere from the narrowest underground tunnels to vast chambers that feel like cathedrals buried beneath the earth. But lately, things haven't been the same. 3 years ago, I nearly died in a cave collapse during a rescue mission. Since then, I've been battling something I never thought I'd face: claustrophobia. It's ironic, isn't it? A man who spent his life underground afraid of tight spaces. But here I am. I work as a cave rescue specialist at Mammoth Cave, National Park in Kentucky, one of the largest cave systems in the world. People come from all over to explore its beauty, but most stick to the safe, mapped-out areas. That's what makes my job easier, or at least it did until last week. It started with a tourist group reporting something strange during a routine tour. They claimed they heard singing, soft, eerie singing, coming from an unmapped section of the cave. At first, we thought it was just an echo, or maybe someone playing a prank. But when we checked it out, there was no one there. No signs of anyone wandering off or sneaking into restricted areas. The park ranger who led the tour swore she'd never heard anything like it before. She said it wasn't just sound. It felt like something was pulling her toward the darkness, like an invisible hand reaching out from the shadows. That's when my boss called me in. "Michael," he said, "we need you to check this out. You're the best we've got." I didn't want to go at first. The idea of crawling into an unmapped section of the cave made my chest tighten and my palms sweat. But I couldn't say no. This is what I do, what I'm supposed to do, even if it scares me now. I decided to assemble a team for the exploration. This wasn't something I could handle alone, especially with all the strange reports coming in. My team included Dr. Rebecca Collins, a geologist, James Parker, a photography specialist, Olivia Washington, a biological anthropologist, and Robert Chen, our equipment technician who could fix anything that broke down underground. We geared up for the expedition, packing everything we'd need: maps, climbing gear, oxygen tanks, and my custom-designed helmet with enhanced lighting. As we stood at the entrance to the cave that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far bigger than any of us realized. We stepped into the cave, leaving the sunlight behind us. The air grew cooler, heavier and quieter with every step. Mammoth Cave is massive, but even in its largest chambers there's a silence that feels alive. It presses against your ears, reminding you how far you are from the outside world. That silence was different today, almost restless. The first few hours were uneventful. We followed the mapped sections of the cave, checking for any signs of disturbance or damage from the recent earthquake. Robert kept stopping to adjust our equipment. The air currents were messing with our radios and lighting gear in ways he couldn't explain. "It's like the cave doesn't want us here," he muttered. Eventually, we reached the area where the tourists had reported hearing singing. It was an unmapped passage, hidden behind a narrow crevice that looked like it had opened up recently. Rebecca examined the rock formations and confirmed they were freshly exposed. "The earthquake must have shifted things," she said. "This passage wasn't here before." We squeezed through the crevice one by one, our helmets barely fitting through the jagged opening. On the other side was a tunnel that stretched into darkness. The walls were smooth, almost polished, as if water had carved them over centuries. But what caught our attention were faint markings on the walls, symbols and patterns that didn't look natural. "Are these cave paintings?" Olivia asked, shining her light on them. She was right. They looked like ancient drawings, but they weren't like anything I'd seen before. They showed shapes that didn't make sense, formless figures surrounded by jagged lines and spirals. Rebecca tried to date them using a portable carbon dating device, but the results were contradictory. "This doesn't make sense," she said, frowning at the screen. As we moved deeper into the tunnel, the air grew colder and thicker, like it was fighting us with every breath we took. The silence turned into a low hum, a vibration so faint you could almost convince yourself it wasn't there, but we all felt it. "Do you hear that?" James asked, stopping to listen. "It's just your imagination," I said, though I wasn't. Sure, I believed it myself. We kept going until we reached a large chamber, a space so vast our lights couldn't reach its edges. In the center was something none of us expected. An underground lake. The water was perfectly still, reflecting our lights like a mirror. But there was something off about it, something unnatural. Rebecca knelt down to collect a sample of the water while Robert scanned the area with his equipment. "The readings are all over the place," he said. "It's like there's some kind of interference." James started taking photographs of the chamber and the lake, but when he looked at his camera screen, his face went pale. "That's not right," he whispered. "What's wrong?" Olivia asked. "The shadows," he said, showing us his camera. The photos showed shapes moving across the walls, shapes that weren't there when he took them. We tried to brush it off as a trick of light or faulty equipment, but deep down, we knew something was wrong. As we explored further, we found more strange things. Crystals growing out of the walls in patterns that seemed deliberate, bones buried in sediment that looked far older than they should be, and remnants of old expeditions dating back centuries. One discovery sent chills down my spine. Journals from explorers who had vanished in these caves long ago. Their entries described experiences eerily similar to ours. Strange noises, distorted shadows, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. That night, as we camped in one of the larger chambers to rest before continuing deeper into the cave system, Robert started acting strange. He said he'd been having vivid dreams about people he'd never met, explorers who had disappeared long ago, and places he'd never been. "I saw their faces," he said quietly as we sat around our small campfire. "I felt what they felt." None of us knew how to respond to that. We were all shaken by what we'd seen so far, but Robert's behavior was different, like something had changed inside him. As I lay awake in my sleeping bag that night, staring at the flickering shadows on the walls, I couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. This wasn't just a cave anymore. It was something else entirely. Something alive. The next morning, we packed up and moved deeper into the cave. Nobody said much. Robert seemed quieter than usual, his eyes darting around like he was expecting something to jump out at him. I didn't blame him. The air was heavier now, and the low hum we'd heard earlier seemed louder, almost vibrating through our bones. We reached another chamber, smaller this time, with walls covered in more of those strange markings. Olivia studied them carefully, running her fingers over the grooves. "These aren't just random patterns," she said. "They're telling a story." "What kind of story?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "It looks like a ritual, something ancient. Whoever made these was trying to trap something here." That sent a chill down my spine. I didn't want to believe it, but the markings felt deliberate, like they were warning us to turn back. Rebecca found more crystals growing near the edges of the chamber, larger this time, and pulsing faintly with light that seemed to come from inside them. "This is impossible," she said, holding one up to her flashlight. "These formations shouldn't exist in this environment." James took more photos, but when he looked at them on his camera, his face went pale again. "They're changing," he whispered. "What's changing?" I asked. "The crystals," he said, showing us the screen. The photos showed the crystals twisting and growing in ways we hadn't seen with our own eyes. As we moved further into the cave, we found something none of us were prepared for. A side chamber filled with human remains. Bones scattered across the floor, some arranged in patterns that looked disturbingly intentional. Olivia knelt down to examine them and found signs of ritual sacrifice. Cuts on the bones that couldn't have been made by natural causes. "This isn't just a burial site," she said quietly. "These people were killed for something." Robert started breathing heavily, clutching his chest like he was in pain. "I need air," he said, stumbling toward the entrance of the chamber. "Stay close," I warned him, but he didn't respond. Rebecca followed him to make sure he was okay while the rest of us stayed behind to document what we'd found. That's when Olivia discovered another set of markings on the wall, different from the others. They showed figures standing around a pool of water, holding crystals like the ones we'd found earlier. "It's connected to the lake," she said. "Whatever they were doing here, it started there." Rebecca and Robert returned a few minutes later, but something about Robert seemed off. His skin looked paler than before, almost translucent under the harsh light of our helmets. His eyes were slightly larger, too, like they were straining to take everything in. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked him. "I'm fine," he replied quickly, but his voice sounded hollow, like it wasn't really him speaking. We decided to head back toward the lake to investigate further. As we approached it again, Rebecca noticed something strange about the water. It was moving against gravity in certain areas, rippling upward instead of outward. "This isn't natural," she said, kneeling down to collect another sample. James took more photos of the lake and its surroundings, but this time he didn't say anything when he looked at them. He just stared at his camera screen with wide eyes before quietly putting it away. I tried to radio base camp for an update, but all I got was static mixed with faint whispers that sounded almost human. "We're losing contact," I told the team. "That's not all we're losing," Olivia said grimly as she pointed at Robert. He was standing near one of the crystal formations, staring at it like he was hypnotized. "Robert," I called. Out, but he didn't respond. When I approached him and grabbed his shoulder, he turned to look at me, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. His face was changing, subtle shifts in his features that made him look less human and more something else. "We need to get out of here," Olivia said urgently. But as we turned back toward the way we came in, we realized something horrifying. The passage had collapsed behind us. We were trapped. We stood there, staring at the collapsed passage in stunned silence. The way out was gone. The air felt heavier now, almost suffocating, and the low hum we'd been hearing seemed to grow louder, like it was coming from inside our heads. "We're trapped," Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. "No," I said firmly, trying to keep everyone calm. "We'll find another way out. These caves are massive. There's always another route." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. Something about this place felt wrong. like it was alive and watching us. Robert was still standing near the crystals, his breathing shallow and uneven. "We shouldn't have come here," he muttered, his voice distant. "It doesn't want us here." "Robert, snap out of it," I said, grabbing his arm. His skin felt cold and clammy under my hand. He turned to look at me, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. His eyes were darker now, sunken into his pale face, and there was something in them, something that wasn't Robert. Rebecca stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We need to keep moving," she said. "Standing here isn't going to help." We decided to head back toward the lake, hoping to find another passage that could lead us out. As we walked, the hum grew louder, and the air seemed to pulse around us. Our lights flickered sporadically, casting long shadows on the walls that seemed to move when we weren't looking. When we reached the lake again, it looked different. The water was no longer still. It rippled unnaturally, as if something beneath the surface was stirring. Rebecca knelt down to examine it again, but froze when she saw her reflection in the water. "What is it?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. When she finally looked up at me, her face was pale. "The reflection. It's not mine." I leaned over to look for myself, and my stomach dropped. The reflection staring back at us wasn't Rebecca. It was something else entirely. Its face was twisted and distorted, its eyes hollow and black. "Step back," I said quickly, pulling her away from the edge of the water. James had been quietly taking photos of the lake and its surroundings, but when he looked at his camera screen this time, he let out a shaky breath. "You need to see this," he said. He showed us the photos, images of us standing by the lake, but in each one our faces were changing. They looked warped and inhuman, like we were becoming something else. "We need to leave," Olivia said urgently. "Now." But before we could move, Robert suddenly dropped to his knees by the water's edge. He reached out toward one of the crystals growing near the lake and began muttering under his breath in a language none of us understood. "Robert!" I shouted, rushing toward him. Before I could reach him, he turned to look at me, and what I saw made me stop in my tracks. His face was no longer his own. His eyes were completely black now, and his skin had taken on an unnatural grayish hue. "It's too late," he said in a voice that wasn't his. Then he lunged at James with impossible speed and strength. James tried to fight him off, but Robert grabbed him by the neck and held him down with one hand while placing his other hand on James's forehead. "No!" Olivia screamed as James's body went rigid beneath Robert's touch. I tackled Robert off of James with all my strength, but it felt like hitting a brick wall. He barely flinched as he turned his attention toward me. His movements were jerky and unnatural now, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "Get back!" Rebecca shouted as she threw one of our lanterns at Robert's feet. The glass shattered on impact, spilling oil onto the ground and igniting a small fire that forced him to retreat momentarily. James lay motionless on the ground as Olivia rushed to his side. "He's breathing," she said shakily. "But barely. We need to barricade ourselves somewhere safe," Rebecca said urgently. I nodded and helped Olivia drag James into a nearby tunnel while Rebecca grabbed what supplies she could carry. Robert, or whatever he had become, watched us from a distance with an eerie stillness that sent chills down my spine. As we sealed ourselves inside one of the smaller chambers with rocks and debris from around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of whatever nightmare we had stumbled into. The chamber we barricaded ourselves in was small and suffocating, but it felt safer than being out in the open. James was unconscious, his breathing shallow and uneven. Olivia stayed by his side, trying to keep him stable, while Rebecca and I worked to strengthen the barricade. Every sound outside the chamber made my heart race. A faint shuffle of rocks, the distant hum that seemed to be growing louder, or worse, the occasional echo of Robert's voice calling out in a tone that wasn't quite human. "He's out there," Rebecca whispered, her hands trembling as she stacked another rock against the entrance. "He's waiting." I nodded, trying to stay calm. "We need a plan," I said. "We can't stay here forever." Olivia looked up from James, her face pale but determined. "I've been studying those crystals and the markings on the walls," she said. "I think I know what we're dealing with." "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "The entity, whatever it is, it's ancient. The people who lived here centuries ago tried to trap it using some kind of ritual. Those crystals, they're part of it. They're not just formations, they're a weapon." "A weapon?" Rebecca asked, her voice skeptical but hopeful. Olivia nodded. "The markings show that this thing can't survive in certain conditions. Sunlight, high oxygen levels, and a specific mineral compound found in these crystals. If we can figure out how to use them, we might be able to stop it." "Stop it?" Rebecca said with a bitter laugh. "We can't even get out of here." "We'll find a way," I said firmly. "We have to." Just then, we heard movement. Outside the barricade, a slow, deliberate scraping sound that sent chills down my spine. Robert's voice followed, soft and mocking. "You can't hide forever," he said. "It's already inside you." Rebecca froze, her eyes wide with fear. Olivia grabbed one of the crystals she'd collected earlier and held it tightly like a lifeline. "We need to move," I whispered. "If we stay here, he'll find a way in." "But James," Olivia started. "I'll carry him," I said quickly. "We're not leaving anyone behind." With no other options, we dismantled part of the barricade as quietly as we could and slipped into another tunnel leading away from the chamber. I carried James over my shoulder while Rebecca and Olivia led the way with their lights and maps. The tunnels felt endless, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. It was like the cave itself was trying to confuse us, leading us deeper into its grasp. The hum grew louder with every step, vibrating through the walls and into our skulls. Then we saw him, Robert, standing at the end of the tunnel ahead of us, or at least what was left of him. His body was twisted and distorted now, his limbs too long and his skin stretched tight over unnatural shapes beneath it. "You can't leave," he said in that hollow voice that wasn't his own. "Run!" I shouted. We turned and fled down another passage, our lights bouncing wildly off the walls as we ran. The sound of Robert's footsteps echoed behind us, faster than they should have been for something so broken-looking. We burst into another large chamber, a dead end with no way out except the way we came in. Rebecca turned to face the entrance with one of the crystals in her hand. "This is it," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "No," I said. "We'll find another way." "There's no time," she interrupted. "Get James and Olivia out of here when you can." Before I could stop her, she stepped toward the entrance just as Robert appeared in the tunnel. She held up the crystal like a shield and shouted something I couldn't hear over the deafening hum that filled the air. The crystal pulsed with light as Robert lunged at her, and then everything went white. When my vision cleared, Rebecca was gone, and so was Robert. The chamber was silent now, but the air felt heavier than ever. Rebecca was gone, and so was Robert, or whatever he had become. Olivia clutched one of the remaining crystals tightly, her hands shaking. James stirred weakly on my shoulder, his breathing still shallow but steady enough to give me hope. "We have to keep moving," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "Rebecca gave us a chance. We can't waste it." Olivia nodded, wiping tears from her face. "She knew what she was doing," she said softly. "She saved us." We stumbled through the tunnels, searching desperately for a way out. Every step felt harder than the last, like the cave itself was trying to hold us back. The hum was quieter now, but it lingered in the back of my mind, a reminder that the entity wasn't gone, not completely. After what felt like hours, we saw it, the faintest glimmer of sunlight filtering through a narrow crack in the rock ahead of us. My heart raced as we climbed toward it, clawing at the jagged edges of the passage until we finally broke through to the surface. The sunlight hit us like a wave, warm and blinding after so long in the darkness. I collapsed onto the ground with James still over my shoulder, gasping for air as Olivia fell to her knees beside me. "We made it," she whispered, her voice filled with both relief and disbelief. But even as I looked up at the clear blue sky above us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. The entity was ancient, powerful, and I knew it wouldn't be defeated so easily. James was rushed to the hospital once we reached safety, but he didn't survive the night. The doctors said his body had undergone changes they couldn't explain, mutations that shouldn't have been possible. They called it toxic gas exposure in their official report, but I knew better. Olivia and I were left with scars, physical and emotional, that wouldn't heal. She discovered trace elements of the entity's presence in her bloodstream during routine tests, and I began experiencing strange sensations, an ability to sense hollow spaces through solid rock, like the cave had left something inside me. We tried to move on, but isolation became our only option. We couldn't risk infecting anyone else or drawing the entity's attention again. Years later, I heard reports of construction workers near Mammoth Cave experiencing similar symptoms, hallucinations, strange dreams, and physical changes they couldn't explain. The groundwater in the area had been contaminated by something ancient and alive. I documented everything in a coded journal, hoping that someday someone would understand what we faced and what still dwells below.